Hello, welcome, Felcher, as they say in Scotland. I am delighted to have an opportunity to talk to you about the wealth of information about Argyll to be found in the Argyll Estates Archives. It's truly an archive that is full of people and places, not just earls and dukes. So trying to work out what to do in 10 minutes when there is such a vast accumulation of stuff, I'm going to focus on 3 particular record sources that tell us a little bit about the story of a farm called Cornigbeck on the island of Tiree in the 18th century. Now those 3 records are a written and drawn survey by James Turnbull that was carried out in 1768-69, a list of inhabitants of Tiree, which was made in 1776, and a volume of Tiree tax or leases that were made in the late 18th century. And we're just going to have a look at the amount of detail about the people who lived in Cornigbeck that can be found in those records. So the Earl of Argyll gained control of Tiree from the Macleans in the 1680s. He'd been pursuing Macleans to impose peace on them. He had a commission from the king to allow him to do that, so that was good. But whilst he was doing it, he also actually collected in some of the debts. So obviously war is an expensive business. The Macleans were sort of using their land as security for money to pay their troops and to get arms. And so when the Earl of Argyll had collected enough debts, he foreclosed on them, and the Macleans had no option but to actually give those lands to the Earl. They couldn't actually come up with the money instead. So this is how the Earl came to hold Tiree. The survey that you see in front of you was commissioned by Jack Campbell, a military commander who later became the 5th Duke. And it was one of the first steps in improving the land. So that's both improving the quality of the land and how it's farmed, but also in increasing the income from the land, which was of course quite important to landowners in the 18th century. So if we have a look, this is the farm that we're going to focus on, Cornigbeck, and this drawn survey includes huge amounts of detail of the land itself. So it has a different key for each type of land, for infield, the outfield, for rocky land, for sandy land, and all this is indicated on the plan, including the individual buildings where people lived. So all of those little square blocks in the middle of the farm there, these are where people are living. And they were living in houses that were probably a little bit like this one. Very thick dwarfed houses with thatched roofs, and the thatches were held down by rope with stones hanging over the edges. So as well as recording land use, the introduction to the written survey includes some information about how the people lived, so their way of life, their education, how they carried out their farming, and as you can see, it was not always complimentary, but drink, illegal distilling and drunkenness were a huge issue with the production from the estate. But as well as having information about the land, the Duke also needed information about the people on the land. If you're going to change the way that you farm and give individual people smaller bits of land that they are responsible for, you need to know how good they are at the job they're doing. And there were a series of lists of people created at the end of the 18th century. And this one is of Tiree from 1776, and the pages in front of you feature Cornigbeck. So this list gives a detailed list of tenants and cotters, their wives, their children, their servants, if they had any, and their approximate ages. So cotters were not leaseholders, but they were allowed to inhabit bits of land or buildings in return for services rendered, which could be general labour, or they could have specific skills which they gave to the community. So from this list, we know there were 9 families of tenants and 8 families of cotters at Cornigback. The 8 of the 9 tenant families were named MacLean, and then there was one McKinnon family. There's more variation in the cotters. There were 4 MacLeans, 1 McNeil family, 1 McFadgen family, 1 McKinnon family, who had married a MacLean, and 1 Snodgrass, who had married a MacLean. Snodgrass is actually a very unusual name in the Scottish Highlands. And amongst the cotters, it's clear that there were 2 weavers and 1 carpenter. But the most interesting thing about this list is the comments which are given. So it includes a description of tenants and what they're like. So descriptors include drunken, sober, industrious, honest, disagreeable to neighbours, and a few other things that we haven't included. So from this entry we can see that John MacLean is honest and can occupy 5 or 6 male land. He has 10 cows and 5 horses, so clearly a competent farmer. Information is confirmed by the list of inhabitants across the entire Argyll Estates, which was made in 1779. Although it's quite interesting the way that people's ages are recorded. So for example, Alexander Snodgrass is recorded as being 38 years old in 1776, but 3 years later, in 1779, he is strangely recorded as being 36. His wife Mary MacLean is recorded as being 38 in 1776. 3 years later, in 1779, she is actually recorded as being 32. It doesn't matter, but it's just interesting to note the variation in ages, and we have to remember that people didn't celebrate their birthdays in the same way that we do today. So the third source we're going to look at is the Tyree tax volume. Now tax are leases, and this volume is full of contemporary copies of original signed leases. There was a copy for the owner, a copy for the tenants, and then there was a copy that was included in this volume. Before 1800, these were usually group tenancies, and they include the names of the tenants, sometimes with genealogical information if somebody's inherited their farm or their lease, the length of lease, improvement and activities required, so building, fencing, draining, as well as the rent due. So this tack of Cornigback Farm is from 1785 and it's to last for 19 years. And it's granted to Hugh MacLean, Malcolm MacLean, John MacLean, Alan MacLean, Alexander MacLean Sr., Alexander MacLean Jr., John MacLean, Charles MacLean, Hector MacLean, and John McKinnon, John McIntyre, and Donald Campbell. And they're described as present possessors, so this is a lease that's been renewed. These are not new tenants. So as mentioned above, distilling and drinking was a significant issue on Tyree, and Hector MacLean from Cornigback was one of those who was identified as an illegal distiller. So the identification was in the early 1800s, and the edict from the Duke was that every 10th man who had been convicted was to be evicted from their land. But as a Cornigback lease was due to expire in 1804, 19 years after 1785, Hector was not evicted. And as it turns out, in 1804, Cornigback Farm was split into 20 divisions, i.e. crofts, to be let to the, I quote, most judicious and most informed of the tenants from each farm, and afterwards let by drawing lots for each division. I suspect that Hector didn't receive a division. So just these 3 documents from the end of the 18th century give you an indication of the wealth of detail about ordinary people from across the extensive Argyll estates. From coal miners in Dollar to farmers in Kintyre, the ordinary people's stories are told in the Argyll Estates Archive. We also have the Earls and the Dukes, but by no means are they the whole story. So these are my contact details. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. I hope to be on chat while this talk goes out, but if by some reason that doesn't work out, there's my email, there's a phone number, and you can find out more about the archive online at inveraraycastle.com. Thank you for listening.